Hello there, Al Murray here. Right, just before we get started, a quick note to say that this Thursday, October the 1st, we're making our live stream available to everyone, not just members of the independent company. It's a chance to give all of you a taste of the fun of the podcast done live on the internet. That's right, you can actually see us while we're disappearing down the forgotten lanes and rabbit holes of the war. This Thursday is a double bill. We're doing a watch-along of Band of Brothers. We call this type of thing Gurglebox. That's at 8:30 p.m, where we all start watching the video at the same time and chat about it. Then at 9:30, we'll be answering your questions about all things Second World War. So, join us at 8:30 on Thursday night. The link will be available on Twitter and on our website, wehavewayspod.com. See you then. I'm looking forward to it. Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And we are delighted, aren't we, James? This is
we are.
This is fantastic.
We're properly thrilled.
Properly thrilled, actually, to be joined today for this edition of the podcast by Robert Harris. Now, those of you who are fans of counterfactual Second World War head scratching, which many of our listeners are, we know that perfectly well from our emails and from our Twitter feed. I've doubtless run into Robert's work over the years, and the level of exhaustive and plainly exhausting research that goes into your books, Robert. And your latest, V2, which James and I have both read. First of all, it's a lockdown book, isn't it?
Yes, well, it was written mid-lockdown, or three-quarters of it, yeah. Yes, I'd written about 20,000 words when we were all told to stay indoors and never go anywhere. And for about 2 weeks, I couldn't write a word. And then I thought, well, to hell with this. I might as well come out with something at the end of it. So I sat down and I got it done. Slightly to my surprise.
Well, because it's a peculiar environment to write in, isn't it? Because you're it's four walls and unstimulating, isn't it? You don't have the normal things that you'd have for writing, which is being able to get away from the book and all that sort of thing, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the periods of recreation are necessary if you're going to have creation, I think, and you need that to break from the desk, and you need to get out and see friends and have a change of scenery, and of course one didn't have that.
Yeah.
And I think most people found during lockdown that it was quite hard to sleep, or the one did sleep, but there were a lot of dreams and your subconscious was all stirred up. So it certainly wasn't easy to write the book, and I couldn't do more than about 4 hours a day, but I did 4 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And lo and behold, we've both read it. Now, the thing is, I live in Chiswick in West London, around the corner from Staveley Road, where the first V2 struck London. The thing that always struck me when I went there, and I filmed there ages ago, but it's a place I go past once a week, is the damage that bomb did, the sheer damage that the first V2 did. It didn't kill very many people, but it caused absolute devastation. These were they're characterised by the Germans as terror weapons, but that's the only real way of looking at them, isn't it? These are a terror weapon, in no two ways about it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And people who lived through all of the Blitz in London, conventional bombing, the Doodlebug, the V1, and the V2, there seemed to be a consensus that the V2 was the most alarming. I mean, it came at the end of the war when people thought the Germans were beaten. They were at the peak 7 or 8 hitting London every day. Yeah. You could quite often hear the bang reverberating right across the capital. There was no warning. It hit the ground at 2,000 miles an hour, so you could even see it.
Yeah.
It did profound damage, as you say, because it hit at such speed, even though it only had a 1-ton warhead, which sounds a lot, but isn't actually huge. It went so deep when it exploded that the shock waves rippled out, and it had caused damage within a radius of about a quarter of a mile. And I was astonished when I was researching V2 to discover that they reckon 600,000 buildings in London were either damaged or destroyed by the V2, and it was a major contribution to the post-war housing crisis.
Which is, I mean, that is a huge amount. And actually, I remember going and talking to a chap who witnessed the last one to come down, which wasn't 27th of March 1945 was the day the last two arrived, and one was in Whitechapel and the second one was in Valence Road in Orpington, which I suppose strictly speaking isn't in London, it's in Kent, but it sort of is because it's a suburb. And that was the last civilian to be killed as well. It was a 34-year-old lady who was killed in that attack. And you know, we were standing on the street that had been rebuilt, and he produced all these photographs of what it had looked like, on the following day, at the end of March 1945. And, it was just absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it sort of looked like Beirut. I mean, it was just absolutely astonishing how much violence there was. I mean, Robert, I thought one of the things that that really kind of got me when I was reading it was this, when you've got Kay at the beginning and and she experiences the V2 kind of firsthand, that kind of sort of sucking out of the atmosphere of the kind of oxygen around her before it came. I thought that was incredibly vivid.
Yeah, I know. It's one of the things that really struck me reading eyewitness accounts. As a woman eyewitness to another strike that's in the novel, where Woolworths was hit at New Cross in Deptford, and a woman who was carrying her baby up the street, she said something as if all the air had been sucked away. And there does seem to have been this momentary kind of, like all the sea had gone suddenly before a tsunami. The air suddenly went. And this was because of the speed at which it was coming down. And then if you were under a V2, you wouldn't hear anything. You'd just feel that. But depending on where you stood, there would be a sonic boom as the thing broke the sound barrier coming in. There'd be the crash of the explosion. And then the very last thing you would hear is the onrushing express train noise of the actual rocket descending. I mean, it's a terrifying kind of futuristic war that's happening in 1944, and it's happening within living memory. That's the other thing that struck me, that one European nation was occupying another European nation and firing ballistic missiles at the capital of a third within living memory. It's an extraordinary thought.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it's truly boggling, actually. And Robert, what I loved about the novel, though, is you've taken this attempt to locate where the rockets are from someone's memoir. It's based on a true story, isn't it? In effect.
Yes, the book's genesis was 4 years ago. There was an obituary in the Times. I've reached this stage of life where the first thing I read in the newspapers is always the obituary. They're so much more interesting and comforting in a funny kind of way than the news pages. And there was an obituary in 2016 of a woman called Eileen Young's husband. Yeah. The obituary was published on a Monday. She died on the previous Friday at the age of 95. She'd been an officer in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAAF. She'd been one of those women involved in plotting incoming enemy aircraft. She was good at mathematics, and she was transferred to this tiny unit about a month after the V2 started hitting London. And the idea was that the V2, which struck London within 5 minutes, and at one point reached a speed of 3,500 miles an hour, and went 60 miles high. There was no protection against it, except the fact that it was ballistic. That is, that it was powered for the first minute, and then it flew like a stone flung from a catapult. And that describes a mathematically calculable arc. So the British decided to send high-looking radars to Belgium, 70 miles south of the Dutch coast where the missiles are being launched from. And they could briefly glimpse this supersonic missile and plot it on. They had cathode ray screens by that time. And then, of course, you'd have the point where it hit in southeast London. And with these two sets of coordinates, you could work back mathematically to the point where it had been launched in the woods around The Hague, invisible to Allied aircraft. And the idea was that if they could make that calculation in 6 minutes, they would then have time to scramble Spitfires equipped with bombs to attack the launch sites, because the Germans took about 30 to 40 minutes to dismantle the launchers and get all the equipment and the and the men out of the way. That was the theory. That was in this Times obituary. And the moment I read that, the idea of these 8 women there were being sent to sit in a bank vault and do these calculations, being billeted on the local population. The Germans hadn't not long gone, and it was said there were still Germans in the area. There must certainly have been a lot of German sympathisers. So it was a sort of, and it was winter. That part of Europe was starving. And so I thought that this would just make a wonderful character. And that's how the novel started. It was to write about her, actually, chiefly.
Well, I think actually one of the things you're really, really good at is getting that wartime atmosphere. And I remember reading Enigma as well, that sense of kind of sort of the drabness of the landscape, of that kind of sort of skeletal monochrome of kind of midwinter or sort of near midwinter anyway. You get that across very effectively. And I remember from Enigma it was kind of sort of, I don't know how long it was, but sort of 3 years worth of no paint anywhere and no fresh paint, and that sort of sense of everything just looking a bit drab and weird. And that atmosphere you got across, I thought, really, really well. Funny enough, I knew Eileen Younghusband because I got to meet her a number of times because she had a lot to do with Bentley Priory, which of course was the headquarters of RAF Fighter Command, and she was in the filter room, I think. In 1940, if I remember rightly, and obviously she wrote her memoir and stuff. But some years ago, after it was sold off by the MOD and by the RAF, they agreed that although it was sort of all going to be turned into kind of swanky houses and a new sort of residential kind of area, part of it would be a museum, and I got roped in to do all the text for that museum, and they were very, very keen that the WAF should be properly represented, and so they had these, they recreated the kind of the filter room in what had been the filter room, and also the sort of plotting tables and things. And she was one of the people that I talked to for that when I was doing all that work. And she, of course, all the grand openings and all that kind of stuff. She was there and everything, and she was absolutely lovely. She was.
Yes, well, I wish I'd known her. I've only seen clips of her being interviewed, and I've read her books, One Woman's War. And she wrote another one, I think. And they are marvellously evocative. I should say that my character in the novel bears no resemblance to her. I didn't, not even the same job, because I thought that it would be more interesting to bring in RAF Medmenham, where the missiles were photographed. Yeah. And I thought that would be quite an interesting character. So she differs from Eileen in both in her job and obviously in her character. But it's only, as far as I'm aware, only Eileen has ever written about the work of that unit. It's not in any of the official histories. There may be something buried in the bowels of the Public Record Office, but obviously when I was actually writing the book, that was closed, so I couldn't actually get to find out. There's very little has been written about it.
That's interesting. Do you think she should have written about it? Is it one of these things that was so super secret that she's why it's not turned up anywhere else?
I don't know quite why it's only her testimony. I mean, she's clearly an honest woman, and you couldn't make it up, as they say. So she obviously did all this, and there was this unit.
And there were definitely WAFs and people from Medmenham and all sorts who were sent over to Northwest Europe, and absolutely were in Belgium and Holland and so on in the latter half of the war. I mean, I've met other people that would do that, and I remember talking to Seb Cox. I don't know if you've ever come across him, Robert, but he's the head of the Air Historical Branch, and sort of, if you ever want to check anything about the RAF, he's your man. But I remember talking about him at great length about all this and about all the women that were kind of sort of, sent over as part of Second TAF and all this kind of stuff. So, so there definitely were people out there. There's absolutely no debate about it at all. But this specific job, I mean, I'm with Al. I had no idea about it.
And one of the things, of course, that made me want to write the book, reading the obituary, was that she said they were told, and I'm sure they were told, that at the end of their first shift, they had actually, the Spitfires had got over in time and had hit 2 of the German launchers. I don't know how many launchers the Germans had, probably only about 30. So it was a significant achievement. And but in all the research that I did, the German sources are pretty clear that the British never hit a single launcher in the whole course of the war. They caught occasionally one out on the back of a railway track, and they obviously disrupted the rail lines, but I don't think that the mission in that sense was a success. oddly enough, that made the book more interesting to me rather than less, because the V2, though astonishingly impressive, and indeed, obviously, an embryo, the rocket that took men to the moon, was not a success. It was a huge waste of resources. And the idea that my two characters, the German rocket engineer, who half the book is about, and the WAF, that both of them, in a way, what they were doing, they missed one another, as it were. It made it a more haunting story, actually.
Yeah. Al and I have talked about the Nazis and their kind of, and about prioritization. And one of my theories about the Second World War is that I think, by and large, you can also always quibble about small things, but I think by and large, one of the things that the British and the Americans do spectacularly well is prioritise what resources they have. They put what they've got sort of pretty much in the right areas. As I say, you can argue the toss over the kind of sort of minor details on certain things, but by and large, they spend correctly and use their resources correctly. Whereas the Germans, who are so short of natural resources, constantly firing off down the wrong alley. They don't.
And their reputation is for being efficient.
Which is one of the great ironies, of course. And before the Second World War, they have this wonderful opportunity to build a really, really large U-boat fleet and train up their crews so that they're ready when they need to go to war. And they don't. They build a surface fleet, which makes absolutely no sense at all, because you can't service that surface fleet. They don't have any overseas possessions, and if you're going to send out cruisers and battleships and what have you out into the Atlantic, you better make sure you've got a base from which you can resupply them. Otherwise, you're going to constantly have to go back through the Royal Navy blockade, which is superior to anything you're ever going to have, and so you're not going to win. So, it makes no sense whatsoever, apart from the fact that obviously, from Hitler's point of view, there's not a huge amount of fun smashing a champagne bottle against a submarine when you can do it against the Bismarck. Hitler's somebody who likes big stuff, and it's that whole kind of sort of big dick syndrome, isn't it? But on a sort of really warped, sort of weird level. And the rockets are kind of sort of symptomatic of that. All you've got to do, and von Braun, you have him saying, of course he's going to back this because he's going to completely love it, and literally, click your fingers, and Peenemünde has turned into a kind of sort of this sort of flat sort of marshland on the kind of sort of Baltic coast has been turned into this kind of sort of mini city, and research facility. It's absolutely astonishing how much money is plowed into that.
That was something I was going to ask you, actually, Robert, because von Braun features in the book. Do you think that Hitler and the people making these decisions were as much beguiled by him as they were by the rocket? Because it seems in lots of ways he's like the rocket. He's aiming for the sky, for the moon or whatever, and he doesn't care how he gets there, like a rocket doesn't. And he really in the novel, that's how I really felt you represent him, as he's so beguiling and he's capable of convincing absolutely everyone of anything to get what he wants.
Von Braun is a absolutely fascinating character, Faustian character, really. He made a pact with the devil. He was clearly very attractive, very charismatic, very brilliant, almost the archetypal Aryan Superman in a way. Not a Nazi. He joined the Nazi party, not an SS man, although he was given an honorary SS rank. There was this sort of thing you had to do, if you were going to get on and build a rocket. And I think he genuinely was most interested in getting into space and building these incredible spacecraft. That's what he wanted to do. And he realized that the only way you'd be able to do it was by the resources of a state. And he combined all these skill sets. He was a very gifted engineer. He was a visionary. He was charming. And above all, perhaps, he knew how to administer a vast project involving thousands of people doing lots of different things. He could hold it all together. And yes, he did beguile Hitler. But the real turning point was they actually made the V2 fly in October 1942. It performed perfectly. It went 60 miles high. It flew 200 miles. They filmed it. And eventually, after a few months, he got in to see Hitler and I love putting this in the novel, in a cinema in the middle of the Wolf's Lair. And eventually Hitler showed up, and they ran the movie, and he stood. It was soundless, but he stood and narrated the way through it. And it finished with a caption saying, "We did it." And Hitler sat there. When the lights came up, he was sort of open-mouthed. He knew that they were going to lose unless there was something, some last manifestation of German genius which could yet turn this thing round. And he fell upon the V2 and commissioned the manufacture of 10,000 of them, which I think was an enormous shock to the scientists at Peenemünde, or a lot of them. I mean, I don't think this is a prototype rocket that should take years to develop, and they're being told they've got to roll them off the production line, and which they did, but at an enormous human cost.
Yes, which you cover in the novel, of course. Now, I've been to Dora camp many years ago, which is where the rockets end up being manufactured after Peenemünde is rumbled by the Allies and then bombed by Bomber Command. They end up in this mountain that's a gypsum mine. It's the most extraordinary place, and you get the heart of the Nazi cruelty in making these machines, because I always think that the really dark irony there is they are training people literally to be rocket engineers. So some of the most skilled engineers on the planet, and then working them to death. And we talk about the cost of the rocket, that the rocket costs more lives than it ever takes. And Nordhausen's Dora is the dark heart of that part of the project.
Yes,
isn't it?
Kammler, the SS brigade Führer who was put in charge of building it, was a civil engineer before the war. He was the ultimate sort of can-do SS Third Reich functionary, and had no interest in human life whatsoever. His previous project had been building the crematorium gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau. So he was told, you've got to turn this, as you said, Peenemünde was bombed. It was no longer feasible to build the rockets there, which is what they were originally planning to do. So they had to find somewhere else. They had this mountain. They had one tunnel through it. They needed to turn it into a factory within 4 or 5 months. And he did it by killing maybe about 20,000 people, just blasting out the galleries and putting in the railway tracks. There was no shelter for these thousands of men. There was no sanitation. There was enormous cruelty. They were worked until they dropped, and they built it, but at this staggering cost. And this is the moral dark side which fascinated me about von Braun and the rocket engineers. It's inconceivable that if you're head of the development program of the V2, you don't know the circumstances in which it's being mass manufactured. It's insane to pretend otherwise. He had an office at Nordhausen. He must have gone there all the time. But because what he had was so valuable, of course, no one was going to prosecute him for war crimes. The British and the Americans and the Russians were all after him to continue the program after the war, which he very well knew would be the case.
We're going to take a short break now. We're talking to Robert Harris. See you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking to Robert Harris about his new book, V2, and a lot else besides.
Kammler is a fascinating character because he's so sort of shadowy, mysterious. There's only one known photograph of him in uniform, and he's another of those people around which conspiracy theories tend to kind of sort of attract like a magnet. And did he die near the Skoda works somewhere in what would have been Czechoslovakia? Did he get his arse over to Argentina? Who knows? I mean, almost certainly he was killed at the end of the war, but he is this. It's extraordinary that someone of his enormous power by the end of the war is so little known. I mean, there's so little on it.
Yeah, no, he's a very shadowy figure, and not a person, in fact, I have to confess that I'd ever heard of until I started on this story. Really, the story of the V2 is the story of a descent into darkness, so it starts with teenagers flying rockets on waste ground near Berlin, moves then to the munitions proving ground, Kammersdorf near Berlin. Then they get the base at Peenemünde. And then gradually the SS begin to take it over. The slave labour starts to appear at Peenemünde to build the factories there. And then when the RAF attacked Peenemünde, as so often happened, it was the slave labourers who couldn't get out of the barracks who suffered the brunt of the casualties. And then they needed a place to test the missile, and so they go to an SS facility in Poland. Then, by the time the thing is operational, Himmler has complete control over the whole thing. And von Braun has spent 2 weeks in a Gestapo cell because they quite rightly had begun to rumble the fact that he didn't think this was much of a weapon either. And he was already thinking about the flat in Manhattan and how he could get this technology across to the Americans. This is a $5 billion project. It was cost, I think, actually slightly more in real terms than the Manhattan project did. It's a huge chunk of German military production. It was like a sabotage of German war economy in the end.
And actually, at the time, in 1942, they decide not to go with the atomic project. I mean, there are atomic scientists there. There's the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and then there is a kind of sort of more Nazified, separate kind of faction of scientists who are working on the atomic bomb, and they quite rightly recognise that it's never going to be done, and they're too far away from doing it, so they give it a kind of sort of very soft backing, crack on and keep seeing where you can get, but this isn't our big backing. What our big backing is going to be is, this other stuff, and it's amazing, really, that again, this is my point about kind of prioritisation. Time and again, you just see the Germans kind of sort of, missing, not seeing what is in front of their noses, and they're sort of thinking, vengeance weapons, rockets, something that can go into space. Clearly that is going to kind of wow the rest of the world so much that everyone else is going to sort of fall at our feet, and we're going to turn the tide of the war. But without any kind of sort of properly kind of thinking it through.
It's a very German thing as well, isn't it? This engineering. I mean, they worked at the Borsig locomotive plant. They worked at Mercedes-Benz. It was big engines. It was fuel and all of that.
Yes.
And the theoretical Einstein science of nuclear fusion was something that wouldn't have been seen as alien. I mean, and Hitler was obsessed with cars and engines and so on. I mean,
yes.
So right. It was it's funny how these weapon systems. I mean, I would love to write a non-fiction book which just looked at Bletchley Park, Peenemünde, and Los Alamos, these three crucibles of the modern world, where you get these enormous leaps in technology, rockets, computers, nuclear power, and each of them, it's thousands of scientists and experts pushed together, resources, no object, and with a state pressure to win a war. And the modern world is made in these three places, it seems to me.
Well, and also, but you could also, you could also see, and a thing James and I talk about on this podcast a lot is that the technologies, even down to uniforms, and what they're made of and how they're made, how they reflect the cultures they represent. So you could do that again. So like you said, the Germans are interested in engineering. The British, you could characterise a lot of British war effort like, how do we puzzle our way out of this without having to commit any actual people? What trick can we use to avoid spilling our own blood? And the Americans are like, blank check to blow the thing up, bang for your buck as your three paradigms of the approaches to the war. And you could almost see those on the three right there, can't
Absolutely.
you? The Germans getting hung up on engineering, the British, and especially as the British thing, Bletchley Park comes out of the Navy as well. Which we're always talking about this on the podcast, that the Navy's effort in the Second World War, the Royal Navy's effort in the Second World War, tends to get overlooked because it all kind of works. It's like trains that run on time. No one complains about trains that run on time, and the Navy delivers what it's asked to do right from the start and creates this intelligence network. The genesis of the whole code breaking comes from there, and then in the US. It's big. I mean, in a way, the atom bomb is a sort of New Deal solution to the war, isn't it? It's a Rooseveltian solution. You spend a load of money, you get the best people in, and you also deliver a thing
vast,
at the end of it.
Space. I mean, you're not going to test the atom bomb on the North Yorkshire moors, are you? I mean, or Cornwall or somewhere. So yes, no, and similarly with the Germans, they had the Baltic. They could fire the missile over 200 miles without hitting anybody. And you're so right about the Navy being overlooked. I mean, it's the Navy that really kept us in the war. And a book I wrote a few years ago about Munich. So the only service when Chamberlain met the service chiefs on the day of Hitler announced that he was about to mobilise, the Air Force wasn't ready, the Army wasn't ready, but the Navy was ready to go. I mean, it was the only one right throughout.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got to say, Al, I mean, I'm as you know, I'm very taken with your theory about, it's a sort of shared theory, really. This idea that you can, natural characteristics do come into it. I mean, it's really interesting also, when you go back to, I remember when I was doing all that work on the dams raid, and I was looking at the German dams, and these engineers that made them, they were absolutely household names. I mean, they were incredibly famous in Germany, and there was now I've forgotten his name, but the guy who straightened the Rhine. I mean, in the sort of early 19th century. I mean, what an amazing kind of proposition that was at that stage of kind of sort of Prussian existence, then German. And the dams, the Ada Dam and the Murner Dam, they're all built on sort of just before the First World War, and the Kaiser came to visit, and it's kind of front page news in all the papers, and the way they described it was also. It was very martial. It's like, we are going to conquer nature. We are taking nature to task, and we're going to show who's the master and all this kind of stuff. So, Hitler would have grown up as well, kind of with all these people, these amazing engineers and these incredible achievements at the time that they were achieved. They were created. Absolutely at the forefront of his mind. So in a way, it's no surprise, I think, that and also because they're so resource poor in Germany, they've got to sort of get round that, and because they don't have access to the world's oceans, a way to do that is by being brilliant at engineering and kind of sort of eking out the most of your river system, and by creating huge dams so you can solve your water shortage, and so you can provide the water that you need for your industrial output in the Ruhr and blah blah blah. And so it's absolutely part of the German DNA when they're trying to rebuild the nation post the First World War, that engineering, that technology, that Bosch and Krupp and all these people would be absolutely at the forefront of kind of getting them out of that mire, and that Hitler is going to be completely enthralled to all of them.
I've another books that I've written in the past about ancient Rome. Engineering in ancient Rome in Pompeii. I've always been struck by the similarity between the Germans and the Romans. Brilliant engineers, warlike soldiers. Taming in nature, as you say, aqueducts, new harbours, huge, monstrous constructions, allied with the martial power and organisation. And the links between the two, right down to the symbolism, obviously, of fascism and the salute and everything, is they really were the modern Romans. And as you say, the Peenemünde was a staggering facility. I mean, the giant test bays, the huge assembly rooms, the wind tunnel, which could reach 8 times the speed of sound. I mean, imagine that. They had a power station. Wow, they had exactly the same S-Bahn overground trains running at Peenemünde, bringing people into work, that they had in Berlin, ultra-modern. They had a population of 20,000. They had a cinema. They had schools. They had airfield. I mean, no expense.
And this goes up in literally a click of a finger, isn't it? Yeah,
it was
but
like
it's
something
so quick,
out of James Bond,
a
secret rocket facility on the Baltic. I mean, it's like Thunderbirds or something. It's enormous. I mean, and always you feel with the British, it's a bit of paper and string and candle ends and
Yes, and in a vicarage somewhere. Yeah. Robert, is this stuff easy to research though? Because surely Peenemünde, there are aspects of it that are still secret because the technology was also snaffled by the Americans and the Russians took what they could. Or is it easy to get hold of a picture of what Peenemünde was like? But obviously it's the Germans, so it's not as secret as things like Bletchley Park kind of still are. But is this information easy to get hold of?
I'd say it's pretty easy, actually. I think that the Russians captured the facility, and there was one senior engineer who went to work for them, who was a communist. But the Americans captured 100 V2s. I think we got 2.
Yes.
And there's one other character says it in the book, we got the craters. And so I think the technology did become quite well known, and it obviously isn't classified now. It's primitive stuff. Well, oddly enough, what is hard to get hold of is actual testimony from the troops that fired the rockets. In fact, I know of only one book that collected about 16 interviews with the people who were stationed in The Hague and were actually firing these things. I don't know why that is. First of all, I suppose there weren't very many of them. Only in all, probably about 4,000 or 5,000 troops, the maximum. And then there was a savage war crime at the end of the war, instigated by Kamler, when the rocket troops were retreating. There was a massacre of civilians. But at any rate, whatever it is, there's no old Comrades Association, there's no memoirs, there's no kind of magazine, all those things that actually crept in later on, they've gone. And anyone firing those rockets would now be about 100. So I would think that their testimony is lost, actually.
Well, maybe also that because the weapons were characterised as terror weapons and they lost the war, forming a regimental association under that banner might be quite difficult. It might not be a thing you want to admit to.
It was an extraordinary, as you were saying earlier, James, for me, weather and adverse conditions and misery are the ideal components for a thriller. And when I went to Sheringham in beginning of November last year, it was hell. I mean, it was a holiday resort in winter. There was rain and wind coming in off the North Sea. You could hardly stand up. I thought, great. Oh, this is marvelous. I mean, to think of these Germans hiding out in the woods, firing ballistic missiles at London. Yeah. I thought I did feel that I'd found something that hadn't really been written about. There isn't much left in the war, that hasn't been written about. But actually, those guys, there's almost nothing.
We had an interesting conversation the other day because we were talking to a chap called Andrew Ziminski. He's actually a stonemason. He's a lovely chap. And anyway, it turns out his father was a Pole. He was he was sort of drafted into the Wehrmacht and had been on the V1s, helping to launch those.
At La Coupole.
At La Coupole.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
I mean, and he ended up working on the quarries in Scotland after the war. He kind of joined the other side and ended up in Britain at the end of the war. And I think a lot of the guys who were in these regiments were Eastern Europeans, weren't they?
I don't know. There were certainly people who've been transferred. No, I think it was too secret. It was highly secret. They tended to be one of two types: either veterans from the Eastern Front who had some technical expertise were transferred into the rocket battalions, or they were raw recruits, very young. And you talk about the V1s. The thing that really wrong-footed the British was that they assumed that these things were going to be launched from some giant bunker in northern France. And it wasn't until quite late on that one of the women at RAF Medmenham doing photo reconnaissance happened to notice that there was a V2 standing erect, ready to launch on the foreshore, and there was no rail link. So, she sort of called the supervisor over and said, look, how are they getting? You realise they must be moving these things by road. And that must have been an alarming moment, because that was when we realised these things were mobile. They weren't going to be launched from some bunker you could capture or bomb. And they could be launched. When they got to Blizna, the British were allowed finally by the Red Army to look at the location. They found that the V2s, this giant 46-foot high, 12.5-ton rocket, was being launched from a platform 5 feet across. That was all it was. So you could just set this thing up anywhere, and you could. I mean, that is real part of the genius of the whole V2, actually, and what made it so terrifying. They couldn't be stopped. So, as we said earlier, right at the end of March 1945, they were still hitting central London and killing hundreds of people.
Yeah, and a huge amount of resources going to trying to stop that, from home defences to fighter command to the crossbow, the whole Operation Crossbow, which involved a huge amount of kind of diversion of bomber command and Air Force resources. And the one thing that is always the case is that everyone will always defend their home territory. That's why all the Luftwaffe is in the Western Front, because that's where the greatest threat is from. You have to defend your home. That is why, Nazi Germany's got 15,000 anti-aircraft guns within Germany itself, and only kind of, 32 on the Normandy front in June 1944. Because you have to, politically, even if you're head of a totalitarian state, you've got to defend the homeland. You just have to. And so that is why, when the V2s come in, in a way, it does involve, although it doesn't, neither the V1s or V2s sort of kill any combat troops in the combat zone. It does involve a huge diversion of Allied resources to try and combat it.
Well, and it's arguably one of the reasons for the Market Garden offensive as well. Is that's about getting into that part of Holland to stop it.
Yeah. And it's a very good reason for
when as you know, when the Market Garden looked like it was going to be a success, the Germans pulled out the rocket battalions from The Hague and moved further up the coast. And London was now out of range, so they could only. But they got the things they wanted to fire them, so they fired them at Norfolk. That's got to be one of the most pointless things in warfare. You have a rocket that costs 125,000 marks, and you fire it at Norfolk, and it scared cattle. That it had almost no military effect. And then when Market Garden failed, the Germans went back into The Hague, and that's when the offensive really got underway. And that's when the book starts, because suddenly they're firing actually as many as 10 missiles a day at southern England.
But also, I mean, that's a point very well made, and which is one of the reasons why Market Garden had to be worth the punt. I mean, you've got this Allied airborne army, you might as well use it, and there is no greater kind of reason for getting across the Rhine quickly than stopping the.
And they almost caught Kamler, of course, famously. They very nearly he came very close to being captured. Bizarrely,
I got the feeling from the book though that to come back to the novel, you were. Robert, you were. How do I put this? Taken with the rocket in a way.
It's fair point.
Does he get? I mean, I almost feel like I know the character better than some of the protagonists.
Well, there are three characters in the book. There's Kay, the wife officer. There's Graf, the rocket engineer, and there's the V2. I get inside the V2 almost as much as I get inside the two human characters, I think. I mean, literally, I like novels with procedure. If you write about a code breaker, when I researched Enigma right back in the 90s, 92, 93, a lot of those guys were still alive, Milner, Barry, all those people. And they used to say, oh, well, Enigma, we did this, then the other, we won in North Africa, we won in the North Atlantic. And I would say, no, just tell me where you hung your hat and where you sat, and what did you actually physically do? I mean, what, if you're a code breaker, what did you have to do? And so I love procedure. And for me, writing about a German rocket engineer, well, what did he do? I mean, what would go wrong? Why would what was standing under these dripping trees in this freezing forest? What was your function?
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed that. I mean, I enjoyed the idea of what he was actually fixing transformers, climbing up ladders, swaying in the wind, trying to get his hands in the control compartments, And of course, the thing was terribly dangerous for the RAF may not have hit any of these guys, but plenty of them died launching the damn rocket. And the citizens in The Hague lived in terror every time they heard one of these things lift off, because they never knew whether it was going to go up or come down or fly across. One of them flew across and hit northern Germany.
Yeah,
it's extraordinary though, and that again, the expenditure of effort for this thing that offered so little reward. Is so much of what James and I talk about is that the Nazis don't seem to realise they're beaten by 1943, and so are carrying on with this utterly harebrained thing. Even
well, I think that it's a product of their system. It's a product of that Führer system, where in the end the decisions were all made by one guy, and you didn't really cross him. And I think that it was pretty clear once one gets into it that Himmler and the SS had rumbled the fact that this was a mad idea, but they couldn't really do anything about it. And it was part of the Führer principle. Again, with Enigma, nobody really wanted to go and tell Hitler that maybe the codes had been broken. You've got 100,000 Enigma machines, spread across the whole of the Wehrmacht and everything, and you say. So there was always a tendency to sort of draw back out of fear or whatever, and definitely his ability to simply, with a stroke of a pen and on a whim and a dream, commission this colossal rocket program. It wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, in America or in Britain. No one person would have had the power, I think, to do that. There would have been checks and balances, but in Germany, obviously, it was possible.
Do you think there's another war novel that you want to write? Is there more in the Second World War? Because you keep coming back.
Well, I've written two books actually in the war: Enigma and V2, and I've written Fatherland, which imaginary German victory, and Munich before it. Well, I am endlessly, like you guys are, and like I assume the people listening to this are, endlessly drawn back to it. It's the biggest single event in human history. It created our modern world politically and technologically, and we live in its shadow, and there are still people alive who lived through it themselves. And I think people will always go back to it because it's simply so huge. And if people say to me, you're obsessed with the Second World War, I'm inclined to say, well, why aren't you?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
Can't argue with that.
Fantastic.
Well, I gotta say, we are all. I mean, you and I are. We're. I mean, every time I sort of think, I sort of finish a book or something or a project, and I kind of sort of think, if my enthusiasm or fascination rather than enthusiasm, kind of sort of wavers. It's never more than about 15 minutes, if I'm honest. Because it's just this period of just such intense human drama as well. You've got this political, social, technological earthquake going on around the globe. And innocent people and ordinary people, you and I, would have been caught up in all this. And that's what I find just so fascinating. And how the events that affect so many million people ultimately is quite often caused by and prompted by a very small handful, which is obviously the lesson of world history. But, that's why it sort of continues to fascinate and enthrall, I think.
It's been an obsession of mine all my life. I was born in 1957, so when I was born in Nottingham, there were still bomb sites there, and everyone had been through the war, and all the television and your comics were all Tommies and Achtung Spitfire, and also by my nature questioning a lot of what I was told, and things changed. That's the other thing about history. Second World War, there's always something new to say. It always every year it looks different. Every year there's a new fashion and things change. And it's an ever-changing mirror, really, in which we examine ourselves. And you ask yourself, how would I have fared? I mean, one of the things in this book was just a small thing. The pilots who flew those reconnaissance missions, pushing heights above Berlin with no heater and an air supply that if it failed, you'd be finished. And one of them describing being so high, he could see the curvature of the earth. He could see the Baltic. He could see the Alps. And below him was Berlin. I mean, and unarmed as well, doing this. I mean, could you do it? Would one be capable of doing such a thing? I think that's one of the things that the Second World War always poses to all of us. How would you have coped? And on the German side, if all your comrades had been involved in some massacre, would you be the one to not take part? Would you be the one to say, no, transfer me out of this? Or would you have gone along with it just because they were your mates and that was what you did and you were young? Again, that's why it's interesting to work on this, because it always asks questions of oneself, I think.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you so much for talking to us. The V2 is out now.
It's just been launched.
I highly recommend it. It's literally, with a countdown. They invented the countdown for the rocket.
It was first used in Fritz Lang's movie Frau im Mond, and right. All von Braun and all the people were involved in doing publicity stunt of building a rocket for that film, which is about 1930, I think. And so, yes, that was the first ever use of the countdown. And when they started building their amateur rockets, they kept it, and they handed it on, obviously, when they started building missiles in the United States.
Extraordinary. Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everybody. See you soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.